Houston, we have a problem. When the calendars turned to 1970, it felt like the morning after humanity's greatest triumph, a kind of historical hangover. Less than a year had passed since Neil Armstrong's famous small step, yet the world had already stopped looking up at the sky. Mankind had reached the moon. The victory was complete. The space race was no longer a gripping primetime thriller on television, but an ordinary technology item relegated to the end of the evening news. Apollo 13 was placed on the launch pad right in the middle of this atmosphere of indifference, with an almost invisible sense of routine. Whether it was taken too lightly or not is unclear, but it felt like a quiet omen of what was to come. In those years, for the American public, traveling to the moon had become as ordinary as taking the subway to work. Inside NASA's sterile corridors and within the minds of the astronauts, however, the reality was very different. Jim Lovell stood at the center of this story, the calm, dignified commander, a veteran who had already orbited the moon but never touched its surface, who had felt the cold breath of space at the back of his neck. This was his last chance. He was one of the few astronauts to travel to the moon twice without ever landing on it, and he would later be remembered as a model of crisis management and leadership. The peak of his career was meant to be the moment his boots pressed into that gray dust. Beside him was Fred Hayes, young, eager, a pilot ready to treat the lunar module Aquarius like an extension of his own body. And then there was Jack Swigert. Perhaps the most ironic twist of fate rested on his shoulders. When the primary pilot, Ken Mattingly, was removed from the crew at the last minute due to a suspected case of measles, Swigert suddenly found himself in the most unforgiving seat in history. Like a substitute player thrown into a championship match in the final minutes, Swigert was abruptly swept into the flow of history. Sometimes it is the substitutes who carry the team and secure an unforgettable place in memory.
Ladies and gentlemen, and dear passengers who are here to mess with time itself, welcome aboard Fast History Airlines. This is your captain speaking. Today's journey will be so short you'll be asking, wait, didn't we just take off? My devoted cabin crew and I will do everything in our power to make this flight enjoyable. As for turbulence, no worries at all. If necessary, we'll just shift into neutral and glide gracefully through the air. Now for the weather report, partly cloudy, and the temperature will be whatever your mood prefers. Feeling cold? It's warm. Feeling hot? It's cool. Once our flight attendants finish handing out refreshments, our journey will continue with plenty of laughter and a generous dose of humor. Please recline your seats. You don't really have to fasten your seatbelts. After all, we didn't come here to be stressed. We came to have fun, right? So sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Today's topic is, Houston, I think we have a problem. Yes, you heard that right. We said no seatbelts, but this time we're going to space. I can tell some of you are thinking, come on already, start the engine and let's fly. Well, my conscience is clear. If you're ready, our flight is now beginning.
Launch day was drawing closer, and the breathless rush continued. The date was April 11, the time 1313. The whispers of superstition were drowned out by the roar of the massive Saturn V rocket at Cape Kennedy. As the 5 engines ignited, it felt as though the Earth itself trembled. It was the moment when the laws of physics turned into poetry. Tons of metal, liquid oxygen, and kerosene defied gravity and rose toward the sky. Aside from the center engine shutting down slightly earlier than expected during ascent, everything was terrifyingly perfect, almost too perfect. It was as if the universe itself was offering a false sense of safety, concealing the disaster that lay ahead. With a thunderous roar, Apollo 13 had already begun its journey into the unknown. Every astronaut who escaped Earth's atmosphere knew that once they were swallowed by that deep blackness, the concept of time changed. There was no longer night or day, only the voice of mission control, the hum of cooling fans, and infinity itself. Watching the blue planet shrink through Apollo 13's window stirred an overwhelming rush of emotion. Despite the quiet sorrow of leaving their families and loved ones behind, they knew they had to remain focused on their task. The first 2 days of the journey were so uneventful that television networks refused to broadcast the astronauts' live transmission from space. After all, a Netflix series wasn't about to begin. Instead of watching men float inside a spacecraft, people chose sitcoms. Lovell and his crew smiled at the camera, demonstrated their equipment, and reassured viewers back home that everything was going smoothly. But no one was watching. The excitement was gone. That broadcast would become one of the most ironic farewell speeches in history. Back in Houston at Mission Control, Gene Kranz and his team stood watching their white vests, surrounded by the familiar atmosphere, calm, orderly, and infused with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Every data point was normal, every chart stable, every heartbeat steady. Apollo 13 was shaping up to be, perhaps, the most boring mission in NASA's history. Routine tasks had to be carried out without delay. Mission time was approaching 55 hours and 54 minutes. Distance from Earth, 330,000 kilometers. The command module they called Odyssey drifted silently through the void. The crew was tired, yet calm, buoyed by the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. They were preparing for the next phase of the mission. At that moment, a simple, routine instruction from Houston would set the gears of fate into motion, irreversibly. 13, we'd like you to stir the cryogenic tanks. It was a standard procedure, performed to homogenize the frozen gases inside the oxygen tanks. In a zero-gravity environment, liquids do not naturally settle or mix, so internal stirring fans were activated at regular intervals. The purpose was entirely routine, to ensure accurate sensor readings, to balance oxygen levels. Jack Swigert leaned back in his seat. Out of the thousands of switches before him, he pressed only a few, hearing that familiar metallic click. The motion he initiated with the tip of his finger was not the flutter of a butterfly's wings. It was like stepping on the tail of a sleeping lion. 1 second passed, then another. And then came that unexpected sound. A metallic, deep explosion, one that rattled every organ inside your body. The spacecraft's hull shook as if struck by a colossal sledgehammer. This was not turbulence. There was no air in space. This was a scream from within. Different thoughts raced through everyone's mind, yet none of them wanted to consider the worst. The first reaction was not fear, but denial. The human mind always searches for a more reasonable explanation before accepting the worst possible scenario. Fred Hayes was in the transfer tunnel to the lunar module at the time and assumed the noise came from a stuck valve. Lovell thought it was a joke. Perhaps Hayes had opened the ventilation valve too forcefully. But when they looked at the instrument panel, the possibility of a joke evaporated within seconds. Fear had now taken hold of the crew. The master alarm lights flooded the cockpit in a hellish red. A chorus of unfamiliar sounds seemed to scream all at once. Electrical voltages were dropping, the computer system was failing, and the navigation platform was tumbling out of alignment. In Houston, the controllers struggled to believe the data appearing on their screens. It couldn't be right. If it were, the spacecraft should have already broken apart. They tried to rationalize it. Instrument error, they told themselves. The sensors must be faulty. There has to be another explanation. There must be. But Jack Swigert, the cool-headed pilot, pressed the microphone button and delivered the sentence that would echo through history. With an eerie calm in his voice, almost as if filing a routine report, he said, "Houston, we've had a problem." When Lovell looked out the window, he was confronted with the truth in its rawest and most terrifying form. In the endless darkness of space, he saw a cloud of gas venting outward from the side of the spacecraft. This was not engine oil. It was not water. It was their source of life, oxygen. Without oxygen, they could not survive beyond Earth. Oxygen Tank 2 had exploded, and in the process, it had damaged Oxygen Tank 1 beside it. The blood flowing through the spacecraft's veins was spilling into the vacuum of space. Unsure of what to do next, they dug deep into their memories, clinging to whatever fragments of protocol they could recall. They were desperate for even the smallest piece of usable information. In that moment, Jim Lovell's dream of landing on the moon went out silently, like the flame of a candle. This was no longer about planting a flag in gray soil, collecting rocks, or making history. It was about getting home, about returning to that blue marble, to their wives, to their children. They could not die now. There was still too much life left to live. Dreams, hopes, and unfinished futures. That day, the explosion in the oxygen tank did not merely tear apart a mass of metal. It shattered the illusion of safety, the comfort of routine, and the belief that we cannot fail. Inside that cramped capsule, 3 men found themselves alone, 330,000 kilometers away, trapped inside a rapidly cooling metal box, suspended in a deadly silence. Their tower was draining, their water supply was dwindling, and worst of all, the air they needed to breathe was leaking into space, second by second. A solution had to be found, quickly. They had to claw their way back to life. For the engineers in Houston and the 3 men in space, the real test was only just beginning. This was a matter of life and death, and there was no time for hesitation. What had begun as a space mission had now become the greatest rescue operation in human history. And as Odyssey, the astronauts' primary living space, responsible for navigation, communication, and the return to Earth, drifted into darkness, only one question echoed in every mind. Would they make it home? The explosion had crippled Odyssey itself. Electrical power, water, and heating systems were failing. The heart of the spacecraft was dying. In the midst of darkness and nothingness, the most expensive and most complex lifeboat in human history drifted silently. Aquarius. Designed to land on the moon, it had now been repurposed as a lifeboat in the wake of disaster. Just hours earlier, this fragile, spider-like machine had been meant to deliver victory on the lunar surface. Now, it was the only refuge keeping 3 men alive. The command module, Odyssey, was dead. Its power depleted, it had become a cold, dark shell of metal and was shut down entirely until the moment of return to Earth. Astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were crammed into Aquarius's narrow cabin, designed for only 2 people. But confinement was not the real problem. The true enemy was time and the unforgiving laws of physics. The lunar module had been engineered to keep 2 astronauts alive on the moon for 2 days. Now it had to sustain 3 grown men for 4 days and carry them all the way back to that blue marble called Earth. This demand went far beyond the limits of engineering, and space showed no mercy. The problems did not end there. The first, and perhaps the most insidious enemy, began to reveal itself quietly: carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is one of the greatest and most silent dangers in spacecraft. It announces itself gently at first, with headaches, shortness of breath, dizziness, before progressing to loss of consciousness and death. With every breath they took, the astronauts were producing their own poison. Aquarius's lithium hydroxide filters were never meant to cleanse air for such a dense population. On the control panels, the needles were climbing, slowly, steadily, toward lethal levels. If a solution was not found, they would not suffocate from lack of oxygen, but from their own breath. They would drift into a deep sleep and never wake up. There had to be a way. All hope now rested with the engineers on Earth, as the 3 men waited, clinging to faith, for good news from home. Back in Houston, in the rear rooms of Mission Control, where cigarette smoke mixed with the stench of stale coffee, a group of engineers gathered to achieve the impossible. The problem before them was, quite literally, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. They ran scenarios endlessly, sketching diagrams in their minds. The disabled command module was full of air-scrubbing canisters, but they were square. The lunar module's receptacle, however, was round. They simply did not match. The engineers dumped everything available on the table: flight plan covers, plastic bags, gray duct tape, hoses, even the astronauts' socks. The task was brutally simple: Using this pile of junk, build an adapter that would keep 3 men alive. Time was running out. As the 3 astronauts in space struggled with headaches and blurred vision, the team on the ground completed a crude prototype they nicknamed the mailbox. Over the radio, they transmitted step-by-step instructions like guiding someone through a Lego set. Lovell and his crew assembled a strange device using cardboard and duct tape. When the final strip of tape was pressed into place and the system powered on, everyone held their breath. Then came the miracle. The pitch of the fans changed and the carbon dioxide levels began to fall. A catastrophe had been averted with cardboard and duct tape. But it was far too early to relax. Aquarius had become little more than a refrigerator. To conserve power, the heaters had been shut down. Cabin temperatures were dropping toward freezing. The astronauts' breath crystallized in the air. Droplets of water formed on metal surfaces. Fred Hayes couldn't sleep from the constant shivering and was battling a kidney infection. Dehydration, hunger, and biting cold were dulling their mental sharpness. In the infinite silence of deep space, with Earth visible through the window as nothing more than a thin crescent, they still had to ignite the engines to set their course home. The navigation computer was offline. Like an old sailor, Lovell had to rely on the stars and the terminator line of Earth to perform a manual course correction. With hands numb from the cold, he guided tons of metal with the precision of a compass needle. And finally, as Earth's gravity began to embrace them, the final preparations began. The ticket home was not Aquarius, but Odyssey. That cold, lifeless capsule had to be brought back to life. Yet a grave fear loomed. Moisture that had condensed behind the panels during the intense cold could cause a short circuit the moment power was restored, and end everything in an instant. The complex checklist that Ken Mattingly had spent days perfecting in the simulator on Earth was followed step by step. By sheer miracle, Odyssey awakened without a single spark. Now it was time to shed weight. First, the surface module was jettisoned. As it drifted away, the astronauts finally saw the true extent of the damage caused by the explosion. The sight was chilling. A massive panel on the side of the spacecraft was completely gone, its internal structure torn open and exposed to space. Had we been flying on top of this wreck the entire time, they wondered. Then came the farewell to the faithful Aquarius, their lifeboat. As they released it to burn up in the atmosphere, there was a quiet sadness, like leaving a trusted friend behind. All that remained was the small command capsule and 3 exhausted men. They entered the atmosphere at nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour. As friction heated the exterior to thousands of degrees, the blackout began. Ionized air blocked all radio communication. Normally lasting 3 minutes, the silence stretched on and on due to Apollo 13's shallow re-entry angle. Inside the capsule, it felt like a lifetime. On Earth, everyone froze. In Houston's Mission Control, in the crowded squares of New York, and living rooms around the world. 3 minutes passed. No voice. 3.5. Only static. 4 minutes. Hope was slipping away. Had the heat shield held? Had the parachutes deployed? Or had they burned up like a shooting star? Then, through the crackle of static, Jack Swiggert's weary but unmistakably clear voice broke through. "Okay, Houston, we read you." In that instant, the heavy air inside Mission Control gave way to tears, applause, and the smoke of celebratory cigars. The capsule descended gently beneath massive parachutes, splashing down into the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean. They had not reached the moon, but they had achieved the impossible. This was not a failure. It was the most successful failure in NASA's history. A miracle reborn from ashes, rocking gently on the waves of the Pacific.